The boardroom was silent, heavy with tension. Richard Cole, a proud CEO, whose empire was slipping through his fingers, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. His company was collapsing, lawsuits mounting, customers fleeing. But instead of listening to solutions, he mocked the last person anyone expected. The janitor, Walter Green, a man who had spent decades sweeping floors, polishing tiles, and quietly noticing what the engineers had missed. He rarely spoke, but when he finally did, offering a simple fix that could save the company, Richard laughed in his face. "I don't take advice from apes," Richard sneered. And then, in front of everyone, he fired him on the spot. What Richard didn't know was that Walter's idea would spark a new empire, one that would outlive his own. And years later, the two men would meet again, when the tables had completely turned. But before we continue with Walter's incredible journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The Quiet Observer. Long before the empire collapsed, Walter Green's mornings began before dawn. The factory floor was quiet. Sleeping robots lined the bays, the smell of aluminum and oil heavy in the air. His breath made small ghosts in the cold. He pushed his mop bucket steadily, never in a rush. Swish. Lift. Ring. Listen. Walter listened more than most. He noticed details others overlooked. Engines rested on stands like silver hearts. And when one ticked strangely as it cooled, Walter paused, fingertips hovering above the block. Something was wrong. A faint vibration, a papery rattle that shouldn't be there. He noted it in his little notebook, then kept working. To most, he was invisible. Engineers whispered behind petitions. "Old man scribbling again," one muttered. "Probably counting stains." Walter heard it, but never reacted. He simply straightened a clipboard, wiped away an oil spot, and carried on with quiet discipline. Because Walter understood something no one else did. Order wasn't about titles or corner offices. It was in the rhythm of small, steady work. Cracks in the empire. The company had once been untouchable. Its cars gleamed in showrooms, symbols of power and success. But soon, cracks appeared, not just in the engines, but in its reputation. At first, it was murmurs. A customer in a service center paid 50 grand, and it broke down in 6 months. Another whispered, "Mine too, transmission died on the highway." Those murmurs grew into headlines. Radio hosts mocked Richard Cole's empire. Better buy 2 cars, one to drive, one for spare parts. Lawsuits stacked like bricks. Investors grew restless. On the factory floor, workers whispered nervously when test cars sputtered during quality checks. Richard's jaw tightened. He marched through the plant in expensive suits, barking orders, blaming everyone but himself. Engineers blamed suppliers. Managers blamed workers. Workers blamed each other. And through it all, Walter mopped in silence. But he was listening, watching, taking notes. He knew exactly what was wrong. Polymer bearings that cracked under stress. Engines running hot because of cost cutting. He wrote it down, underlining it twice. The breaking point. Late-night boardroom meetings dragged on. Charts dipped lower. Voices rose louder. Executives argued in circles. Richard slammed folders shut and snapped. "Enough. I don't want excuses. I want solutions." But solutions never came. Until one tired engineer, half joking, muttered, "Maybe we should ask the janitor. He spends more time around the engines than we do." Nervous laughter filled the room, but Richard's eyes narrowed. "Bring him in." Moments later, Walter stepped into the boardroom, mop still in hand, shoulders slightly hunched, uneasy under the fluorescent lights. Richard leaned back, smirk sharp as a blade. "Well, Walter, since my expensive team can't figure it out, why don't you tell us what's wrong with our cars?" Walter's voice was calm, steady. "Engines are overheating. Polymer bearings can't take the stress. That's why they crack early. Reinforce that, and your cars will last." The room fell silent. Executives exchanged uncertain glances, because deep down, they knew he was right. But Richard laughed. A cruel, mocking laugh. "I don't take advice from apes. You belong in the forest." And with that, he fired Walter. Right there. In front of everyone. Walter didn't argue. Didn't beg. He simply nodded, set down his mop, and walked out with dignity that made the room feel smaller. But one man noticed. An investor named David Langston, who had quietly listened in the corner. He followed Walter out. "You weren't wrong," he said. "The engines are failing exactly as you described. If you're willing, I'd like to back you. Start your own line. Build it better." For the first time in years, Walter felt his heart race. All those scribbled notes, all those quiet observations, finally had a chance to become something real. A new beginning. Months later, a small workshop came alive. Walter worked side by side with his team, not towering over them like Richard once did, but shoulder to shoulder. He sketched designs late into the night, grease on his hands, sweat on his brow. Workers respected him. Customers began to trust him. Word spread fast. Walter's cars were different. Strong. Reliable. Built to last. Truckers swore by them. Families invested in them. Demand exploded. Meanwhile, Richard's empire collapsed. Headlines screamed of bankruptcy. Investors fled. The mighty CEO who once mocked a janitor was now cornered. His empire reduced to rubble. Full circle. The bankruptcy chamber smelled of old paper and failure. Richard sat slumped at the table. His once pristine suit wrinkled, tie hanging loose. Lawyers whispered numbers that bled red across the pages.
The doors opened. Walter Green stepped in. Not with a mop. Not in coveralls. But in a dark tailored suit, polished shoes, shoulders squared. In his hand, the same notebook he once carried through the factory halls. The room froze. Richard's face drained of color. "You," he whispered. Walter didn't gloat. He simply sat down, signed the papers, and bought the company that had once thrown him away. Then he stood, voice calm but firm. "Arrogance cost you everything. Respect costs nothing. The best ideas don't come with a title. They come from the people you ignore." No one moved. Richard stared at the table, broken. And Walter walked out, not just the owner of the company, but the living proof that humility builds what arrogance destroys. Closing call. So what do you think of Walter's rise? And Richard's downfall? Stories like this remind us that greatness doesn't always come from the top floor. Sometimes it comes from the quietest corners. If you believe overlooked voices deserve respect, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because the janitor they dismissed became the men who redefined it all.